Hi, everybody. I'm Miss Elliott, and I'm a second grade teacher at Madison Elementary, and I am going to be reading for you today one of my favorite books. It's called Henry's Freedom Box, a true story from the Underground Railroad, and it's written by Levine and Kadir Nelson. And I really like this book because it talks a lot about bravery and working hard to get something that you really really want. And I think that that's really important for us to read. So as I'm reading today, I want you to think about all the ways that Henry was brave and how he showed that bravery throughout the story. Henry's Freedom Box. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They're torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. I like this story too. It won a Caldecott Award, which means that it was recognized for the artwork in the illustrations, and I really do enjoy them. I like the way they made the brick look very realistic and had the different points of view for the leaves and for the people, and you can really see their expressions. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners. Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You're a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he did not say thank you, because that would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Don't tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy, and he poked the boy with a stick. "If you made a mistake, the boss would beat you." Like that guy. Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, and then another and another. Henry knew that they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Henry was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he's going to sell our children," she said, and Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. I really like this illustration. I don't know if I can get a good picture for you, but it really shows the worry on his face in the artwork, the way that they did a kind of a close up. You can really tell in his eyes and in his face that he's really concerned and worried. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" Henry cried. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twitch that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twitched in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. Father, father! Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and he wiped away his tears, and Nancy, too, was gone. Henry no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew that he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree and into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early in the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves, he said. James stared at the box and then at Henry. What if you cough and someone hears you? I will cover my mouth and I will hope, Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia, and then he printed on the crate in big letters, this side up, with care. Henry needed an excuse to stay home, or else the work boss would think that he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew that wasn't going to be bad enough. He opened up a bottle of oil of vitriol. No, cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand, and then they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. Ready, he said, and James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a piece of paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves and splashing. This must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached, and he thought his head was going to burst. Have you ever did a headstand and your face starts to feel hot or hung upside down from the monkey bars? He did that for hours. I can't even imagine how much that must have hurt. He was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. I'm tired of standing, someone said. Why don't we move that box and sit on it, said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Oh, try to get you a close look at him inside the box there. So he was sideways, and then he got to be straight up again. They turned him over here on this side. He's all the way upside down. And then they turned him on his side, and then the other side, and then finally right side up. Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, and now on his left, and suddenly he was right side up. Oh, that had to feel so much better, even though he was still squished inside that box. What do you think's in here? Said the first man. Mail, I guess, said the other. I guess I am mail, thought Henry, but not the kind they'd imagined, because he was shipping himself to Philadelphia. He could also mean that he was male, like he was a man. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." There's an author's note in the back that I think is important to read too, and it says, in the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe that 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom traveling on what's called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways that slaves had made their way from the south to the north. They hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in winter. Conductors or station masters helped to hide them or help them through their journey. And these were often people who were kind citizens who thought that slavery was wrong and would help provide places in their basements or behind walls or in secret passageways. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he'd hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits. Henry arrived in Philadelphia, having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia, in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe. Henry never found Nancy and his children. In 1850, he went to England, and there are some reports that he married again. We do know with absolute certainty that Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. That's Henry's Freedom Box. There's also another book that you can get at the library called Henry Box Brown, and it's really cool. There's a video that goes along with it that goes into a lot more detail, but I do like this story. So I hope you enjoyed it and can tell me a whole bunch of things about bravery and how Henry was brave. You can leave them down in the comments or just come and see me and tell me all about it. Love to talk about Henry Box Brown.